Hello, my name is Guy Raffa. I'm Associate Professor in the Italian Studies program at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm also the creator and director of the Dante World website, which I hope you will visit often to study and learn more about Dante with your class or on your own. Dante was born in 1265 in Florence. He died in 1321 in Ravenna. He's known as a great poet, but he was also a soldier and a great political leader in Florence. The main events that really affected Dante took place in the years 1300 to 1302. In 1300, he was 35 years old, which by his calculations was the halfway point conventionally of a person's life. And so he thought that was a really important moment in his life to sort of assess where he was and determine sort of where he was going. And it was also a place for him to sort of look around him and sort of determine what was happening at this midlife point in the history of Europe and in Italy. And what he saw was something that made him very, very upset. He was one of the leaders in the city in the summer of 1300. And so when he was in power, he had to make some decisions that upset people on the other side of the political aisle. And eventually in 1301 and 1302, he was cast out of Italy when the other political party took power. So Dante was forced to then leave Florence and live the rest of his life in exile. And as I said, the last few years he spent in this city, Ravenna, and wrote the final parts of the Divine Comedy before he died there. Dante is famous really for two words, Divine Comedy. The Inferno, his poem about hell, is the first part of the Divine Comedy. The second two parts are the Purgatory and the Paradiso. And so all three of these poems take place in the afterlife. Dante tells us about his journey to hell and then to purgatory and then to heaven. And he tells us this story in order to sort of show us all the things that people have done in the world to then determine their fate after they die. The main reason that Dante's poem is so famous is because he actually tells us about the afterlife. He meets all these different people from his day and age and from the past. He meets their spirits or their souls. And so by having conversations with them, he's able to sort of look back to the past, but also reflect on the present and actually express his hopes for the future. So these are the main reasons that we study Dante today and the main reasons that he's so famous. When Dante imagines himself in the afterlife, he looks back on the past, and what he sees first and foremost is Rome. And the reason that Rome is so important for Dante is because he thought of it as the center not just of political power, as the place where the Roman Empire had been centered, but also as the place of great spiritual authority, because that's where the Vatican was, that's where the papacy was. And so for Dante, Rome was this very special place that God actually selected as sort of the place for the center of both political and spiritual power. Now, when Dante is writing, his view is that the Pope at this time has too much power, and the emperor or the political rulers of his time do not have enough power. So when he looks back at Rome, he sees it as a model for the present, but as something that sort of teaches him that things are not right the way they are now. Dante thinks of the emperor and the pope as sort of co-equals, independent authorities, one with spiritual power and one with political power. He actually gives sort of a theory or a name to this political philosophy. He calls it the two suns theory. He imagines that there are two suns in the sky, one of them sort of representing the spiritual side and one of them representing the political side, and they're equal. Each of them is its own source of light, so to speak. If we contrast that with the Pope of the time, we can see sort of how radical, in some sense, Dante's political philosophy is. The Pope at that time is a man named Boniface VIII, who in many ways really is the Darth Vader of the Divine Comedy. He's Dante's public and personal enemy number one. Boniface, unlike Dante, doesn't talk about two suns, he talks about two swords. And for Boniface, these two swords, one representing the spiritual side and one representing the political side, are both supposed to be held by him, the Pope. In other words, the emperor does not have any sort of co-equal power or authority with the Pope. One of the most dramatic and in some ways humorous scenes in the Divine Comedy occurs in the Inferno in this Canto 19, and it's a place where Dante imagines the people who were church leaders but who were corrupt, and so they're punished there for this sin that's called simony, which is an abuse of power from a religious authority. And when Dante is traveling through hell, he actually sees he sees one of these popes who's buried upside down, and Dante only sees his legs sticking up out of the ground. And this is a pope named Nicholas III, who died many years earlier. Well, Nicholas III, of course, cannot see Dante because he's buried head first in the ground. And so he hears Dante's footsteps, and he says to Dante, "Is that you, Boniface? Is that you here already?" And the reason he says that is because Dante allows the spirits in the afterlife to actually see the future. And so Nicholas III actually knows, because he can see into the future, that Boniface, his successor, the pope who's supposed to come after him, and who's alive at Dante's day and age, is supposed to come down to hell, and he thinks that he's actually come there a few years before his time. Okay, so Dante, in a way, is able to tell us that his enemy Boniface is destined for hell even several years before Boniface actually dies. And so Rome is sort of the center of power for Dante, for both the religious and the spiritual side. And because the Pope, from Dante's perspective, has too much power, has in some sense eclipsed the power of the emperor, the world has gone off course or is astray. So this unhealthy, distorted relationship that Dante sees between the Pope and the Emperor is really at the heart of what he sees as the major problems that are plaguing Italy in his day, in his present day. And when Dante is born, so he's born in 1265, the major political configuration concerns two different parties called the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And the Guelphs tend generally to be aligned more with the goals and the policy of the Pope, whereas the Ghibellines tend to be more in tune with the Emperor. And Dante's family is a Guelph family, and so he is sort of from this tradition that has great respect for the Pope and the papacy and the Church, and is in some sense in opposition, again, to this Ghibelline party. And so when Dante is actually going through hell, he encounters spirits who are from the other side, from the Ghibelline party. Dante himself is a soldier, as I said. He serves in the Florentine military in 1289, so he's about 24 years old. He's a member of the cavalry when it goes to battle and goes to war against the Ghibellines of Arezzo. Arezzo is another city in Tuscany. And this famous battle of Campaldino takes place in the summer in late June of 1289, and Dante is right in the middle of the battle as one of the cavalrymen, and he survives the battle, but he obviously sees many men who are killed on his side and on the other side. During this battle, Dante probably encountered one of the leaders of the other side, this man named Buonconte, and when he writes the Purgatory, the second part of the Divine Comedy, he actually imagines meeting the soul or the spirit of Buonconte in Purgatory, and he asks Buonconte, "What happened to your body?" Because he knows from having been there that Buonconte was killed in the battle, but nobody could find his body after the battle was over. And so in the Purgatory, Buonconte gets to tell the story of how bleeding he left the field of battle and eventually arrived at the riverbanks, and that's where he fell, and with a prayer and a very sincere tear of repentance, his soul was saved, but his body was washed away by the river and was never to be found. And so these are all scenes in which Dante imagines characters from history, people that he either heard about or that he knew about, who are actually on the other side politically, and he tells us sort of the stories of their lives. By the time Dante is a little bit older and is starting to enter Florentine political life himself in the middle of the 1290s, the Ghibellines have pretty much been removed from the scene, and the Guelph party itself has split into two different groups, one called the White Guelphs and one called the Black Guelphs. And the difference here is really more just a matter of local politics and socioeconomic factors. The Black Guelphs tend to be a little bit more aristocratic, kind of tied to the old ways. They're a little bit more aligned with the Pope of the time, as well as with the French monarchy, the French princes, who are also supporting the Pope. The White Guelphs, of which Dante is a member at this point, are really a little bit more aligned with the imperial side, in other words, the defeated Ghibellines to some extent, and also with the new classes, the new merchant classes that are starting to sort of take hold in Florence and starting to change the economy and the social structure of the commune. And so Dante is one of the White Guelphs, and he is actually in power in the year 1300, as I said earlier, when he has to make decisions that will actually then cause him to get in trouble later and to be exiled from Florence. He imagines that his journey to the afterlife takes place in 1300, as I said. So he's 35 years old, but he's writing this story much later. Probably starts at about in 1307, so about 6-7 years later. And so he's able to sort of have characters whom he meets during the journey in 1300 see into the future and kind of tell him, Dante, the character in the poem, things that are about to happen to him. And this is one of the most dramatic ways in the poem that he's able to give us information that is very personal to him in terms of his exile. So one of the characters he meets, for example, was a friend, somebody he knew from Florence named Ciacco. And Ciacco in hell, in the Inferno, is a glutton, and so he's being punished for his excessive indulgence in food and drink. But Ciacco talks about politics, and he tells Dante that within a few years, within 2 or 3 years, that he will actually sort of be a victim of the political changes that are taking place in Florence. Later, when he's in purgatory, Dante meets Forese Donati, who was actually a relative of his on his wife's side, Dante's wife's side. Forese was actually part of the Black Wealth contingent, and so Dante shows at least some spirit of reconciliation in trying to sort of bridge the gap between the two political parties. One of the other passages from the Purgatory is one of the most famous from the entire Divine Comedy. In the 6th canto, Dante gives us a very, very long lament about the state of Italy, which he calls here enslaved Italy, that Italy is now a servant or is enslaved. And the reason he says this is because he believes that all of the political rulers have given up on Italy in one way or another. They've been negligent. They've abdicated their duties to Italy and to the rest of Europe, and so Italy has been sort of without a leader, has been wandering on its own. And part of the reason for this is also because of the Pope, again, because of the papacy having too much political power and opposing at this point some of the political leaders who might be able to do something good for Italy. So Dante passionately hopes that Italy will be freed from foreign oppression because you have all of these different rulers from different parts of Europe who are controlling different pieces of Italy. And he also hopes that the country one day could be more unified. And so he actually looks at the failures of political leaders and the interference of the Pope as reasons for the problems that are sort of plaguing Italy in his day. Dante's nostalgia for the Roman Empire does not prove to be very important in later history, but his idea that Italy needs to be freed from oppression and needs to be unified becomes a very, very important idea for Italian patriots and their supporters in the 19th century. And in fact, Dante is praised as the father and prophet of Italy by the leaders of the Risorgimento, which is the revolutionary movement, the independence movement for Italy in the middle of the 19th century. You might think that Italy is already a country, but no, that's not really the case. It's kind of a geopolitical unit with people speaking various dialects of Italian, but it's not formally, politically a nation until the middle of the 19th century, and this happens because of this uprising, this Risorgimento in 1859 to 1861. And so the people who are leading the charge to make Italy this free, independent, and unified country are calling on Dante as kind of Italy's ancestral father and even the prophet, the person who actually first saw the need to free Italy of foreign oppression and become a unified country. So Dante represents this figure of freedom and liberation in Italy, but not only in Italy and not only in Europe. In the 1860s, if you think back to history, the United States is involved in a civil war that's being fought in large measure to determine the fate of slavery in the United States. It seems a bit surprising maybe to us today, but when we look at documents from that time, Dante was seen as this great representative of freedom and liberation for people who were opposing slavery, who were trying to end slavery in the United States. Dante was seen almost as an equal with Abraham Lincoln, believe it or not, as this figure of the great liberator in the 19th century. So today, Dante is probably the most recognizable Italian name in the world. He's become a global icon. And that's because he's not only this canonical elite figure who's so important academically, artistically, in terms of politics, but he's also this very important entertainment figure, a figure with very, very broad popular appeal. We see this, for example, in the video game, the Inferno video game that was released by Electronic Arts in 2010. and which focuses naturally enough on the Inferno. And so, Dante was recognizable enough to the people who made this video game that they thought he would be a good way to get young people to sort of journey to the afterlife in the heels of Dante. The great blockbuster novel by Dan Brown called The Inferno, the scientist, this mad genius, is inspired by Dante to take some very drastic actions to combat this problem of world overpopulation. And so Dante serves there not only as a source of material, but sort of as a moral voice in the background of the story. The television show Mad Men famously included a scene where the main character, Don Draper, an advertising executive, is reading The Inferno on a beach in Hawaii, and we actually hear his voice reading the first lines of The Inferno, saying that midway along the course of his life, he walked to find himself astray, alone in a dark wood. And the show tells us at that point that in many ways the crisis that this character is suffering is also the crisis of the whole nation. This is 1967, during the midst of the Vietnam War, and lots of social and political, economic problems plaguing the country. And so Dante is just a very easy way, in some sense, for the show to sort of convey the crisis that is taking place both for this character and for the nation as a whole. So whether Dante looks back to the Roman past, or at his Italian present, or even toward the future, a global future, in many ways he provides an enduring model for how we understand our world and our place in it.